Yat-e. Yat-e. Mark Charles Yinishia. Sin beke dene nishle, do to higlini bashischin. Sin beke dene dashache do to chitni dashanella. In our Navajo culture, when we introduce ourselves, we always give our 4 clans. We're matrilineal as a people, and our identities come from our mother's mother. My mother's mother is American of Dutch heritage, which is why I say Sin beke dene nishle. Loosely translated, that means I'm from the wooden shoe people. My second clan, my father's mother, is Tohiglini, which is the waters that flow together. My third clan, my mother's father, is also Sin beke dene, and my fourth clan, my father's father, is Totochitni, and that's the Bitterwater clan. It's one of the original clans of our Navajo people. I want to acknowledge today that where we are, where many of us live, I moved here from the Navajo Nation with my family about 8 years ago. We are on the traditional land of the Piscataway. The Piscataway, they're the nation that they were living here, hunting here, farming here, fishing here, raising their families here, and burying their dead here long before Columbus got lost at sea. And they are still here. I have had the honor of meeting some of the Piscataway. I've been to some land acknowledgements and welcomed by the Piscataway. I want to honor them as the host peoples of these lands. And I want to just publicly state how humbled I am to be both living and walking on these lands today. Over the next hour and 10 minutes, I am going to offend you. Not intentionally, not on purpose. But I'm going to say things that are going to make you want to look for a way to exit politely. I'm going to say things that are going to make you squirm in your seat. I'm going to say things that are going to confront both your faith as well as your political and societal allegiances. At some point, you maybe want to stand up and try to throw something at me. Resist all those urges. Stay seated. If I'm offending you and your neighbor seems to be smiling, don't worry. In a few minutes, I'll be offending your neighbor and you will be smiling. The challenge is there's some history in our nation that we don't know how to talk about. We don't know what to do with it. And so we ignore it. We're having a national dialogue right now on white Christian nationalism. And we are probably one of the most ill-prepared groups of people in the history of the world to have a national dialogue about white Christian nationalism. We have a very young, I would call it a preteen, unfortunately, but a very heavily armed and well-financed nation. And we have a very simplistic 2-party political system that creates every dialogue as binary. And political work is to obstruct when you're out of power and to force things down the throat when you're in power. On top of that, we have a very partisan media that largely leans to the left. And most people live within a media bubble. You can probably recognize fairly quickly those who live within the Fox News bubble. But there's also a CNN and NBC news bubble. And most Americans exist in one of those 2 spaces. And those spaces are designed for 2 very express purposes. A, to make you angry and fearful. And B, to keep a certain political party in power. And so in this dialogue that we're having, we are laying the bulk of the blame of white Christian nationalism at the feet of white evangelical conservatives. Now, don't get me wrong, white evangelical conservatives have a lot to be held accountable for what they're doing regarding white Christian nationalism. But if you believe that we are addressing a merely simplistic partisan problem that only requires us to call out a villain on one side and remove a certain party from power, you need to get out of your news bubble. Over the next hour, my goal is to convince you that the doctrine of discovery is at the foundation for our white Christian nationalism. And this nationalism is a bipartisan value that has been written into the foundations of our nation and has created an ongoing dysfunctional theological imagination for almost all U.S. citizens. That may look like a very long run-on sentence. And you might be thinking you're never going to do that in an hour. And you might be right, because it takes me about 2 hours normally. So I'm compacting this into 1 hour. But I really want to have this conversation with you. Several years ago, almost 2 decades ago, my father was serving on a synod study committee for the Christian Reformed Church. And they were looking at creation care. What do we need to do to take better care of creation? My father, a Navajo man, said to the white men on the study committee, so, well, the reason the U.S. doesn't know how to care for creation is because they have a doctrine of discovery. The men of the committee said, what's this doctrine of discovery? I don't know what that is. He said, my father, ever the teacher, he was a high school teacher, said, look it up. So they Googled it. They learned that the doctrine of discovery is a series of papal bulls, edicts of the Catholic Church, written between 1452 and 1493. It says things like invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans whatsoever, reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, convert them to his and to their use and profit. It's essentially the church in Europe saying to the nations of Europe, wherever you go, whatever land you find not ruled by white European Christian rulers, those people are subhuman and their land is yours to take. If you're wondering why in front of Union Station we have a statue honoring Columbus as the discoverer of America, it's because of this doctrine. So their study committee recommended that we start a task force to look at the doctrine of discovery. I was serving on the board of trustees for the CRC at the time. And so I was on this task force looking at the doctrine of discovery, and we began to research. And one of the questions that I was most intrigued in is, how does the church, based on the teachings of Jesus, who said insane things like love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, how does that church get to a doctrine that says you can kill people who don't look like, sound like, act like, worship like, or speak like you? I wrote this book, Unsettling Truths, the ongoing dehumanizing legacy of the Doctrine of Discovery, with my good friend Singchan Ra. He was a professor at North Park Seminary. Now he teaches at Fuller Seminary in Pasadena, California. And we address this. And over the next hour, I want to take you through some of this history of the church, as well as of our nation, and demonstrate to you what this doctrine has done. Now, to understand the doctrine of discovery, we actually have to go back, all the way back, to Old Testament Israel's land covenant with the people of Israel. The people of Israel had a land covenant with the God of Abraham. The land covenant wasn't very complex. It basically said if you obey God, God will bless you and you will flourish in your land. And if you disobey God, God will punish you and remove you from their lands. We see this encapsulated in Deuteronomy chapter 30, where it says, keep his commands and his ordinances and his laws and the articles of our covenant with him, that we may live and be multiplied. This is just being read to the people of Israel as they're standing on the banks of the Jordan River, ready to cross over into Canaan. It says that we may live and be multiplied, and that the Lord our God may bless us in the land, whether we go to possess it. But if our hearts shall turn away, obey and we worship other gods, we shall surely perish out of the good land, whether we pass over this river to possess it. So the land covenant set up a barometer of prosperity for the people of Israel, right? They could know with fairly good certainty if they were prosperous, if their borders were strong, if their families were fed, if their people were secure, that they were doing well in their relationship with God. If they were exiled from their lands, if they were hungry, if their borders were porous, they could understand that there was something amiss in their relationship with God. Prosperity wasn't their only barometer, but it was one of their main barometers. So when Jesus came into the world, Israel was not prospering. They were under the oppression of the Romans. They could not worship freely. They could not travel freely. They were being taxed. They could not worship freely. And they hadn't heard from God in a long time. And they were waiting for God to send a Messiah to come and restore them politically back to the greatness of the kingdom of David, to throw off their Roman oppressors. Now, Jesus came as the Messiah, and he knew very well the expectations of the people, but he also knew he had a very different agenda. And so he came in a way to try to change their expectations. So yes, he was the Messiah, but he was born in a barn and raised as a refugee. Yes, he was the Son of God, and angels announced his coming, but they were singing to a group of shepherds. Right? He was changing their expectation of what this Messiah was about. And the people of Israel were eager, right? They had all these sects. They had the Pharisees who were trying to compel God to send the Messiah quicker by keeping the law of the priests as lay people. They had the Essenes and these other groups that were trying to do things to compel God to send a Messiah quicker. And so when Jesus came into this earth, he had to deal with all these expectations. And one of the first stories we hear is in Matthew 4, where Satan, who also assumed the idea was an earthly kingdom, he took Jesus to the top of a high place. He showed him what he thought was the goal, which was the kingdoms of the world. And he said to Jesus, all these kingdoms have been given to me. If you bow down to me, I will give them to you. Jesus wasn't tempted. He walked away. He rebuked Satan. That wasn't the goal. A little bit later, John the Baptist, who was the one announcing the coming of Jesus, he was arrested and put in prison. In prison, he heard that Jesus was healing the servants of centurions and raising the children of widows from the dead. This was not what a political earthly Messiah would be doing. And so he sent his disciples to Jesus and said, hey, are you the one we're looking for, or should we wait for somebody else? I love Jesus. He turns around, heals more sick people, casts out more demons, gives sight to more of the blind, hearing to more of the deaf, and says to John's disciples, go back and tell your master what you've seen, and blessed is he who doesn't stumble on my account. Jesus rebukes John the Baptist. This is who I am. This is what I'm doing. Either get on board or get out of the way. In John, it's recorded that Jesus was teaching in front of a large group of people, and they were in the middle of nowhere, and the people were hungry. Jesus knew this. They found this kid. They shook him down. They grabbed his lunch. And he took this little Lunchable, and he fed everybody with it. Right? And the people were like, oh my gosh, this is the Messiah. And they came to make him king by force. And Jesus is like, no, that's not the goal. And he walked away. In Mark chapter 8, he's with his disciples. He's been teaching for half this gospel so far. And he says to his disciples, who do the people think I am? Well, some think you're an Old Testament prophet. Some think you're Elijah. Others think you're John the Baptist come back to life. So how about you? Who do you think I am? Peter, forever the spokesman, says, I think you're the Messiah. Now, Jesus doesn't ding, 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 you got it. Let's go tell everybody, right? He turns to Peter and says, shh, don't tell anybody. And then he begins to teach them that the Messiah, the Son of Man, was going to suffer and be persecuted and even be crucified on a cross. This was so contrary to what Peter and all of Israel expected of their Messiah that Peter arrogantly took his own teacher to the side and began to publicly rebuke him. And Jesus saw the disciples watching this, and he looked at Peter and he said, get behind me, Satan. You are not on the side of God, but of men. And this creates a tension, a rift between Christ and his disciples for the rest of the book of Mark. And the whole second half of the book of Mark is this ongoing debate between him and his disciples, which is what about this role of persecution for the Messiah? And Jesus goes beyond that. He says, not only will he be persecuted, but he says they will be persecuted. In Luke 21, it says they will seize you and persecute you. They will hand you over to synagogues and put you in prison. You will be brought before kings and governors, all on account of my name. You will be betrayed even by parents, brothers, sisters, relatives, and friends. They will put some of you to death. Everyone, Jesus said, will hate you because of me. See, he was changing the paradigm. We see this in Matthew 5, where he tells them, blessed are you not when you prosper, but when you're persecuted. If you want to know how you're doing well in your discipleship with me, it's not when you prosper, it's when you're persecuted. And just like you and I, the disciples did not like this idea, right? They were not on board with this at all. And so it's no surprise when the soldiers came and they came to arrest Jesus, his disciples fled. They weren't down with this, not one bit. Jesus is brought before Pilate. Pilate's a nice guy for a politician, right? He doesn't want to kill Jesus. He's looking for a way to set him free. He's asking him some questions to get him to talk. And Jesus isn't helping his case because he's remaining silent. Finally, in frustration, Pilate says, don't you know I have the power to set you free or to kill you? And Jesus scoffs at him and says, you have no authority. The only thing you have is what my Father in heaven gave to you. If my kingdom were of this earth, my servants, the angels, would come and set me free, not my friends who I call, not my disciples who I call my friends. He said, my kingdom is not of this earth. My kingdom is somewhere else. Jesus was adamant until he died. He did not come to establish an earthly political kingdom. That was not his goal. His kingdom was somewhere else. So Jesus resolutely rejected religious nationalism. Everyone expected it of him. John the Baptist, Peter, James, John, all the disciples, they wanted this. And he's like, no, that's not what we're doing. So in the first century, when you had this ragtag group of people called the church, who came together because of a common baptism, through their community, and through a common confession, you knew when you joined this group of people that there was a good chance you would be persecuted for your membership and probably even put to death. This continued for 4 centuries. And there were lots of persecutions of the church, and they were known for what they were enduring. Now, if you're like me, probably all of your life, at least I did all of my life, I blamed what I'm going to call the heresy of Christendom, the heresy of Christian empire, on Constantine, right? 4th century, he converted, made all of Rome Christian, fundamentally changed what it meant to be the church. Now, instead of joining the church through your baptism, your confession, your community, now you're a part of this church because of your citizenship in the empire. He moved the capital. I've always blamed the heresy of Christendom on Constantine. But in researching this book, I wanted to include the story of Constantine's vision at Melvane Bridge. I hadn't read that story. I'd heard about it, but I hadn't read it. So I looked it up and found it was recorded by Eusebius, who was the bishop of Caesarea. And I started to read through the writings of Eusebius, and it blew my mind. You see, in the 4th century, Eusebius was doing something that had never been done before, which is he was trying to write out an ecclesiastical history, the history of the church. It's actually a volume of 11 books, right? It's a long history. The first several books establish the divinity of Christ. He starts with the babies who were killed when he was born, kind of glosses over his life and picks it up with Stephen and his martyrdom, and goes on to show, because all the disciples, right, they finally got the picture, not at the death, but at Pentecost, right? Pentecost, they finally jumped on board. And as a result, almost all the disciples went on to die a martyr's death, setting the example for the rest of the church for 400 years. So Eusebius records this. The first several books of his volumes of his books of his volume, he holds up highly the martyrs of the church. These are pious men and women who are sharing in the suffering of Christ, dying for their convictions and their beliefs. Now in chapter 8, he introduces a new figure who is Constantinius. Constantinius is a blessed man, we're told, which is confounding because he is actually an emperor. And then we get introduced to his son, Constantine, who we are told is a God-ordained emperor of Rome, which is a little mind-boggling because up until now it was the emperors who were persecuting the church, and now we have God ordaining an emperor of Rome. Between books 8 and 9, he inserts a book. It's called the Book of the Martyrs. The Book of the Martyrs talks about what's the greatest persecution in the history of the church, which is the Great Persecution of 404 AD. He identifies that this persecution took place in his own backyard in Palestine and Caesarea. He identifies that he knew many of the martyrs himself and that he actually saw some of them die with his own eyes. So the persecution touches him personally. Beginning in book 9, he begins to change his tune regarding martyrs. And instead of focusing on their piety, he begins focusing on the emperors and what can be done to end this persecution. Now, if you're writing a book called Ecclesiastical History, right, the history of the church, common sense or a basic theological knowledge would lead you to conclude that your book doesn't have an ending, right? Because ecclesiastical history will not conclude until the bride of the church comes back, or the bridegroom of the church returns. Because you're writing the book, this is evidence, this hasn't happened yet. So you're merely writing the prelude, you're writing an early chapter in what will probably be a very, very, very long saga, right? It's already been 400 years. The notion that this is going to happen quickly has long been expelled, and you don't know how long this is going to go on. So you're writing an early chapter. But if you read to the final chapter in the last book in this long saga of ecclesiastical history that's recorded by Eusebius, you will find he absolutely has a conclusion. The chapter is called The Victory of Constantine and the Blessings of Him Accrued to the Whole Roman World. And he says, at the same time, they celebrated and extolled, first of all, God, the universal king, because they thus were taught. Then they celebrated the praises of the pious emperor, and with him all his divinely favored children. The supreme God granted from heaven above the fruits of his piety and the trophies of victory over the wicked and the nefarious tyrant with all his counselors and adherents. He cast prostrate, not the feet of Christ, but of Constantine. See, if you want to ordain an earthly empire, if you want to establish a religious nationalism based on the faith of your Christian belief, your biggest obstacle is Christ. So if you want this thing to have any hope of taking root, what you have to do is you have to write Christ out of ecclesiastical history and insert Constantine. His next book is just flat out heresy, right? The Life of the Blessed Emperor Constantine. Chapter 4 was titled How God Honored Constantine. Chapter 6 was He was the servant of God and the conqueror of nations. Chapter 7 was titled He conquered the whole world. What did Satan promise to Jesus if he would bow down? Chapter 28 was titled How He Was Praying. God sent him a vision of a cross of light in the heavens at midday with an inscription admonishing him to conquer by that. And chapter 29 was titled How the Spirit of God appeared to him in his sleep and commanded him to use in his wars a standard made in the form of a cross. Now, there's another church father who saw a vision of Christ, right? This is Paul, who was on his way to Damascus to persecute the church. And Christ appeared to him, blinded him, and sent him stumbling into Damascus. And sit there for 3 days. Then he sent him a prophet, Ananias, who came, restored his sight, and gave him his commission. And his commission was that he was going to become the apostle to the Gentiles. And he told him how much he was going to suffer on account of this calling. Why? Is Jesus punishing Paul for what he did? No, what's the barometer? If you follow Christ, you're going to suffer, right? Constantine might have seen a vision. I'm not going to doubt that. I promise you, his vision was not of Christ. I promise you, his vision was not Christ. Christ would not have appeared to the emperor of the most powerful nation in the world and told him to conquer and kill and establish earthly kingdom under the standard of a cross, which is about suffering. He would have said the same thing to Constantine that he said to Paul, which is, you are going to join this ragtag group of people, and instead of being the persecutor, you are going to become the persecuted. So Constantine might have seen a vision. I promise you it was not of Christ. So in the 5th century, right, we have this problem, which is now we have this heresy known as Christendom. Because Constantine bit on Eusebius's heretical teachings, made Rome Christian, and moved the capital. And now we have an established Christendom, a Christian empire. So it's up to the theologians of the day. What are they going to do? How are they going to respond to this heresy? Well, Augustine was one of the major theologians of the 5th century. Augustine is known for writing a just war theory. Right? The just war theory has two purposes. A, it's to help nations fight wars more justly. And B, it's actually how to justify how these Christian citizens of this Christian nation can go off and kill in the name of God and country, because a plain text reading of Jesus' teaching doesn't allow this. So you have to do some theological gymnastics. So I use the fact that he had a just war theory as evidence that he was choosing to collude instead of prophesy. But I wanted to see where he crossed the line, right? Because when you cross the line with Jesus, he tends to call you out. So I was reading through his writings on just war. I was reading through his writings on the two kingdoms. And while he was fairly certain that the kingdom of man was not like the kingdom of God, he kind of said, but this is what we have, so let's try and make it work for us. I got to his writings on the correction of the Donatists, and the Donatists were a heretical group, kind of a thorn in his side, all of his ministry. And in this book, chapter 5, he's asking actually a very good question, which is, what is the role of a Christian king in a Christian empire? We've never had this before. We've always had persecuted people under a pagan empire and a pagan king. What do we do now that we have a Christian kingdom and a Christian empire? It's a good question, but has a horrible premise, because it accepts the theological existence of a Christian empire. So he concludes that the role is to prevent and chastise with religious severity all those acts which are done in opposition to the commands of the Lord. He said, for man serves God in one way, in that he is a man. He serves him by living faithfully, but in that he is also king, he serves him by enforcing with suitable rigor such actions as ordain what is righteous and punishes what is the reverse. In chapter 6, he says, if the nations of the world have the right to kill people who break men's laws, how much more right does the church have to kill people who break God's laws? He said it's better, I'm sorry, that's the next one. It's better that men should be led to worship God by teaching than they should be driven into it by fear of punishment or pain. He said many have found advantage in first being compelled by fear or pain, so that afterwards they might be influenced by teaching. So Augustine is arguing that the role of the Christian king in the Christian empire is to compel people through fear, punishment, and pain to keep the commands of the church and the teachings of Jesus. And this is a complete opposite to what Jesus taught. If Jesus didn't have a problem saying to St. Peter, "Get behind me, Satan," he would not hesitate for a moment to say to St. Augustine, "What are you thinking? You're not on the side of God, but of men." But unfortunately, no one called out Augustine. And so his teachings laid the foundation for the Crusades, right? Which were about expanding the kingdom and protecting Jerusalem. In the 13th century, we have another theologian, Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas is also wrestling with heretics, and he makes the argument that if worldly kingdoms have their authority to kill men who break God's laws, or break men's laws, how much more right does the church have to kill people who break God's laws? He says it's a much graver matter to corrupt the faith which quickens the soul than to forge money which supports temporal life. Wherefore, if forgers of money and other evildoers are forthwith condemned to death by the secular authority, how much more reason is there for heretics, as soon as they are convicted of heresy, to not only be excommunicated, but even put to death? So he's arguing the role of the Christian king in the Christian empire is to kill people who don't keep the teachings of Jesus or the commands of the church. Now, also in the 13th century, we have the introduction of this word infidel. It's a subhuman category applied to the Moors or the Muslims, later applied to indigenous peoples, anyone who doesn't keep or worship the God of the white European Christian male. Now that we have this category of infidel, we don't even need a just war theory anymore, because now we can fight our wars based on theological grounds. We're fighting the other, we're fighting the enemies of Christ. So it's out of this in 1452 that Pope Nicholas V writes out the words invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans whatsoever. Tells the people they can reduce their persons to perpetual slavery and convert them to his and to their use and profit. So this doctrine of discovery, which is the church in Europe, saints in the nations of Europe, wherever you go, whatever lands you find not ruled by white European Christian rulers, those people are subhuman and their land is yours to take. This is what allowed European nations to go into Africa, colonize the continent, and enslave the people. They didn't see them as human. It's the same doctrine that Columbus, who was literally lost at sea, land in this new world, which was already inhabited by millions, and claimed to have discovered it. Right? The first sentence of the first chapter of this book says you cannot discover lands already inhabited. You can conquer those lands, you can steal those lands, you can colonize those lands. You cannot discover them unless your theological, your worldview, your belief tells you that the people already living there are not fully human. So this doctrine of discovery is a white male supremacist and Christian nationalist doctrine that is the direct fruit of a church that has been prostituting itself out to the empire for 1,400 years. Now in 1763, King George draws a line down the Appalachian Mountains. And he says to the colonies that are here that they no longer have the right of discovery of the empty Indian lands west of Appalachia. This upset these 13 colonies. They want access to those lands. So a few years later, they write a letter of protest. In their letter, they accuse the king of raising the conditions of new appropriations of land. And they go on to state that he has excited domestic insurrections amongst us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages. They signed their letter on July 4th, 1776. Literally 30 lines below the statement, all men are created equal, the Declaration of Independence refers to natives as merciless Indian savages, making it very clear the only reason the founding fathers used this inclusive term, all men, because they had a very narrow definition of who was actually human. We also need to point out it only says men, not women. Joe Biden loves to misquote this document. All men and women are created equal. I agree that they are created equal. That's not what the document says. We can't fix it just by misquoting it. This Declaration of Independence is a systemically white supremacist and sexist document. A few years later, the founding fathers write another document. They begin this one with the words, "We the people of the United States." Of course, this is the preamble to the Constitution. Again, this sounds inclusive. This sounds good. If you keep reading, not much further, just a few lines, down to Article 1, Section 2. This is the section of the Constitution that determines who is and who is not a part of the Union, who is and who is not covered by this Constitution. If you read Article 1, Section 2, the first thing you will note is it never mentions women. Now, this is important because if you read the entire document, preamble through the 27th Amendment, you will find there are 51 gender-specific male pronouns, 51 he, him, and his, who can run for office, who can hold office, even who's protected by the document. Oh, Mr. Charles, you say this is the Old English. In the Old English, he meant everybody. Yeah, do you know why it meant that? Because they were sexist. Women couldn't own property. They were seen as, like, they couldn't own land. They couldn't vote. They were seen as property. The Old English is sexist. There is not a corporation in existence today that is operating on language written in the 1700s. They couldn't exist. They would be sued. But we run a nation on a constitution written in the language of the 1700s, and we've done nothing to fix it. Anyone from Virginia here can agree with me? Right? You just ratified the ERA a couple years ago. But because we passed the deadline, didn't become an amendment. Prove that this summer, that women are not treated as equal under the Constitution. Even though there was a bill in front of the Democratic-led House, the Democratic-led Senate, and the Democratic White House to extend the deadline for passing the amendment, it sat there for 2 years and nothing happened. Just so you know, this isn't a partisan problem. So in other words, right, 1787, if you don't include women, you don't include natives, you count Africans as 3/5 of a person, right? Which is what Article 1, Section 2 does. If you exclude those groups, who are you left with? Well, white men. And technically, it was only white landowning men who could vote. See, we don't think about this enough. The purpose of the Constitution, the reason it was written, was to protect the interests of white landowning men. Right? So today, we act shocked that women earn 60 to 70 cents to the dollar. This isn't surprising. The Constitution's working. We act outraged that our prisons are filled with people of color. This isn't surprising. The Constitution's working. People get angry that a while ago, the Supreme Court agrees with Citizens United and rules that corporations now have the same rights to political free speech as individuals. This opens the door for super PACs, unlimited supportive candidates. Right? This isn't surprising. The Constitution's working. It's doing what it was designed to do. It's protecting the interests of white landowning men. So the Constitution of the United States, today, as written, is a systemically racist, sexist, and white supremacist document. And don't take my word for it, right? The Supreme Court agrees with me. In 1857, they had the Dred Scott decision, which we'll talk more about later, ruling that African people are not citizens and therefore they're not protected by this document. In 1823, we had a Supreme Court case. This is Johnson versus McIntosh. There's two men, they're of European descent, they're litigating over a single piece of land. One of them got the land from a native tribe, the other one got the same land from the government, and they want to know who owned it. Who had the right to sell the land, the tribe or the nation, the government? This is the John Marshall Court, considered one of the greatest Supreme Court jurists in our nation's history. And they had to determine the legal precedent for land titles. They ruled the principle was that discovery gave title to the government by whose subjects or by whose authority it was made against all other European governments, and that title was consummated by possession. So they used discovery as the precedent. Now that would imply that the native nations living here had precedent there. So to clarify his thinking, John Marshall wrote, "But the tribes of Indians inhabiting this country were fierce savages, whose occupation was war and whose subsistence was drawn chiefly from the forest. To leave them in possession of their country was to leave the country a wilderness." This case, along with a few others in 1854, 1855, and 2005 are cases that directly by name reference the doctrine of discovery when it calls to question sovereignty of land by native nations. I have a TEDx talk online. It's called "We the People, the Three Most Misunderstood Words in US History." Goes into these cases. I want to talk about the 2005 case here. So in 1770s, the Oneida Indian Nation occupied about 6 million acres in central state New York. The Washington administration reduced that holding down to a few 100,000 acres through a treaty. And then they passed a law that said this land is for use only of the Oneida Indian Nation and no one else can purchase these lands except the federal government. The state of New York continued to illegally purchase the lands until all the lands were bought up and the United were moved out of New York. In the 1990s, they came back into the state and they bought some of their traditional lands on the open market. They paid full price for them. And they wanted to reestablish their traditional sovereignty over these lands. Now, the city of Sherrill, which is where the lands they purchased were, didn't like this idea because they wanted the tax revenue from the lands. And so they sued the Oneida Indian Nation in federal district court. The court ruled in favor of the Oneida, so they appealed to the Court of Appeals, and that decision was upheld. So they appealed again to the Supreme Court. The case was heard, I think, in 2004, and in 2005, the Supreme Court issued their opinion. In their first footnote of the case, where they're establishing precedent for their reversal of the previous decisions, they reference by name the Doctrine of Discovery. They go on to state that given the long-standing, distinctly non-Indian character of the area and its inhabitants, the regulatory authority constantly exercised by the state of New York, and the Oneida's long delay in seeking judicial relief, we hold the tribe cannot unilaterally revive its ancient sovereignty. They reference another case that says it's impossible to rescind the cession and restore the Indians to their former rights because the lands have been opened up to settlement, which was white settlement, and large portions of them are now in the possession of innumerable innocent purchasers. They go on to argue that, moreover, the properties here involved have greatly increased in value since the Oneidas sold them 200 years ago. Notably, it was not until lately that the Oneidas sought to regain ancient sovereignty over land converted from wilderness to become parts of city like Sherrill. Now, if that sounds familiar, it's because it's basically the exact same argument that John Marshall made in 1823. Doesn't use the word savage, but it makes the exact same argument. So the Supreme Court concludes that we reject the unification theory of the Oneida Indian Nation and the United States through the lower courts, and we hold that standards of federal Indian law, again, footnote 1, Doctrine of Discovery, and federal equity practice, the land settled by white people, preclude the tribe from rekindling embers of sovereignty that long ago grew cold. This is probably one of the most white supremacist Supreme Court opinions written in my lifetime, and was written and delivered by Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Now, this is shocking, right? Because the legacy of Ruth is that she was a voice of dissent on an increasingly conservative Supreme Court. White supremacy is the fruit of the right, not the left. And she was advocating for the rights of the marginalized, which she was and she did. However, because land titles, the house you live in, the land your church and your buildings and your institutions are built on, the justification for those lands is not a treaty, because even though the U.S. signed close to 500 treaties with Native nations, they've all been broken. Your land titles are based on this dehumanizing doctrine of discovery. And this makes white supremacy a bipartisan value, as demonstrated very clearly by Justice Ruth. So the Supreme Court agrees. The Constitution of the United States is a systemically racist, sexist, and white supremacist document. I have to go through a little bit because we're not going to have time here. So in 1630, now I'm going to go back a little bit. 1630, there's a group of people. They're in what's now called the Boston Harbor, and they're here to plant the Boston colony. On board this ship is a Protestant minister named John Winthrop, and he preaches a sermon titled A Model of Christian Charity. Many politicians quote this sermon a lot because he refers to the people he's with as a city upon a hill. He's borrowing from the language of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, where he tells his disciples to be a lamp on a stand, a city on a hill, shining their good deeds into this dark world. He goes on to exhort them in all meekness, gentleness, patience, and liberality. They should rejoice together, mourn together, labor and suffer together. They should keep the unity of the Spirit within the bonds of peace. These are just your basic Protestant Christian exhortations. End of his sermon, he does what most pastors do, which he tries to compel his congregants to heed his exhortations by quoting from the Old Testament. He chooses to quote from Deuteronomy chapter 30. And he reminds them, but if our heart shall turn away so that we will not obey and we worship other gods, we shall surely perish out of the good land, whether we pass over this river to possess it. Now, Deuteronomy 30 says river, but in his sermon, John Winthrop changes that to vast sea. And why does he do that? Well, they didn't cross the river, right? They crossed an ocean. So what's he saying? Based on the exhortations of Jesus to be a city on a hill, based on the model of Old Testament Israel, they are standing on the banks of their promised lands, ready to go and take possession of them. Now, if you know your Old Testament history, you don't have to read much further in both Deuteronomy and Joshua to understand what it means to have promised lands. In Deuteronomy 20, God says, however, in the cities of the nations the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, do not leave alive anything that breathes. Completely destroy them, as the Lord your God has commanded you. See, promised lands for one people is literally God-ordained genocide for another. I call this sermon the birth of American exceptionalism. American exceptionalism isn't just the notion that Americans are better at everything. It's that we have a different and unique and divine relationship with the God of Abraham. That we have promised lands. And if you don't believe me, just look at our politics, right? 8 years ago, Benjamin Netanyahu was in our country speaking to a joint session of Congress. He was lobbying against the Iran nuclear deal that the Obama administration was negotiating. He was talking to a very partisan, a very divided Congress, and he had to get everyone on the same page behind him. So early in his speech, he said to our Congress, because America and Israel, we share a common destiny, the destiny of promised lands. If you want to know why the United States Congress has almost unanimous bipartisan support for the modern nation state of Israel, it has nothing to do with freedom or equality. We need their history of promised lands to justify what we did to Native peoples and African Americans, and the modern nation state of Israel needs our flourishing as a nation with a manifest destiny to justify what they're doing to Bedouins and Palestinians. We have a very dysfunctional, incredibly codependent relationship with the modern nation state of Israel. It has nothing to do with freedom or equality. It's about justifying our history and our legacy of oppression, and in our case, even genocide. So now that we have a dehumanizing doctrine of discovery, we have a white supremacist and racist Declaration of Independence, a white supremacist, racist, and sexist constitution. The Accord agrees through their precedents, and now we have God's permission to commit genocide. We have to talk about our history. So that idea percolates for about 100 years. This is 1630. Mid-1700s, we begin expanding westward. Late 1700s, we have the Second Great Awakening. There's this growth in churches, a renewal in denominations. There's now this religious fervor as we're going further and further west. And early 1800s, the term manifest destiny is coined. And this is devastating. Now, I could go on for 2 hours talking about the history, easily, and it would wrench your heart. I want to take about 20 minutes and completely turn your world upside down. Because we have to talk about this, right? Two of the hardest chapters to read in this book that will make you throw the book against the wall are chapters 9 and 10. Because in 9 and 10, we deal with this question, or this statement, which is the victors write the history, right? Now, this isn't news to anybody. We know this. We accept it. We actually celebrate it. Why do we celebrate this as Americans? Because we've never lost a war that matters. We've never lost a war. Every single major military conflict we've been involved in, we have won. We've never surrendered. We've never been occupied. We've never had a regime change. We've never been disarmed. We've never given up large tracts of land. Every single major military conflict we've been in, we have won. Technically, the Korean War is not over. We pulled out of Vietnam and Afghanistan, but we didn't lose any land there. As a result, for 250 years, white men have written their own history. And this isn't something to celebrate. It's incredibly dangerous. Just imagine with me for a moment, just pretend with me for a moment that Nazi Germany wins World War II, okay? They win the war. How would their historians record the legacy of Hitler? He'd be their greatest leader ever, right? Brought them from global obscurity to global prominence. Had they won World War II, how would they have recorded the legacy of the Holocaust? Well, we have Holocaust deniers today. Imagine if they won the war. What Holocaust? There was no Holocaust. The reason chapters 9 and 10 are going to make you want to throw the book against the wall is because we take that understanding and apply it to this man. See, the US has written its own history for 250 years. As a result, we don't have a clue who Abraham Lincoln is. We don't have a clue. So let me introduce you to him the same way he introduced himself to our nation when he ran for Senate in 1858. It was known that he was against the institution of chattel slavery, right? But we had just had the Dred Scott decision in 1857, and the debate of the midterm elections was, what about our foundation's application to people of color? That's what everyone wanted to know. They weren't debating slavery. They were debating, do our foundations apply to people of color? So Abraham Lincoln had to address that. So early in the debates, he said, I will say then that I am not, nor ever have been in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and black races. I am not, nor ever have been in favor of making voters or jurors of Negroes, nor of qualifying them to hold office, nor to intermarry with white people. I will say in addition to this that there is a physical difference between the white and black races, which I believe will forever forbid the two races from living in terms of social and political equality. And insomuch as they cannot so live while they do remain together, there must be the position of superior and inferior. And I, as much as any other man, believe that the superior position belongs to the white race. Abraham Lincoln was a blatant, self-proclaimed white supremacist. Now, when he was running, he lost that race, but he went on to run for president 2 years later, and he won that race. Again, he was against chattel slavery. He and Judge Douglas disagreed on enslavement. They agreed on white supremacy. Judge Douglas thought we needed enslavement to keep white people superior. Abraham Lincoln was pretty sure we could keep white superiority without chattel slavery. So when he got elected, there was an uproar. The nation was in a tizzy because now we elected this anti-enslavement president, and several states in the South were threatening to secede. And so the morning of his inauguration, Congress was in this tizzy, and they actually passed an amendment called the Corwin Amendment. The Corwin Amendment states that no amendment shall be made to the Constitution which will authorize or give to Congress the power to abolish or interfere within any state with the domestic institutions thereof, including that of persons held to labor or service. The Corwin Amendment constitutionally protected enslavement in states where it already existed. And they passed it a few hours before the inauguration began. In his address, Abraham Lincoln, again, was introducing himself, and he said, apprehension seems to exist among the people of the southern states that by the ascension of a Republican administration, their property and their peace and personal security are to be endangered. There has never been any reasonable cause for such apprehension. Indeed, the most ample evidence to the contrary has all the while existed and been open to their inspection. It is found in nearly all of the public speeches of him who now addresses you, I do but quote from one of those speeches when I declare I have no purpose, and he begins quoting himself from the Lincoln-Douglas debates. He then goes on to say, I understand a proposed amendment to the Constitution to the effect that the federal government shall never interfere with the domestic institutions of the states, including that of persons held to service, to avoid misconstruction of what I have said, holding such a provision to now by implied constitutional law, I have no objection to it being made express and irrevocable. He's in agreement with the Corwin Amendment. Absolutely agrees with it. And he's saying this because there's 4 states, northern states, that weren't going to secede from the Union. There were Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware, and these 4 states allowed enslavement. It was legal in those states. Now, after his inauguration, he actually mailed personally the governors of all the states this amendment, asking them to ratify it. It didn't get ratified, so it did not become our 13th Amendment. In 1862, Horace Greeley, who was the editor of the New York Tribune, he was writing an op-ed calling for the immediate freeing of the enslaved peoples. This was a promise of Abraham Lincoln that he wanted it to happen immediately. Abraham Lincoln actually had the Emancipation Proclamation written. It was in his desk. But he was afraid to release it because of these 4 states. Of these 4 states. So he responded to Horace Greeley in a letter. And in his letter, he said, my paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union. It is neither to save or destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. If I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. So his response to Horace Greeley was, I don't care about Black people. I'm doing this to save the Union. Black lives don't matter. So the Emancipation, and so in January of 1863, he releases the Emancipation Proclamation. If you've never read it, it's actually very specific where it frees enslaved peoples. They're freed in Arkansas, Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia. Missing from this list is Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware. And it clearly states that accepted parts are for the present left precisely as if this proclamation were not issued. And the slave peoples in those 4 states didn't get their freedom until after Lincoln was assassinated. Now, the legacy of Abraham Lincoln is the 13th Amendment. Right? And most people think the 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. They think it says neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist within the United States. See, to understand the 13th Amendment, you have to understand Lincoln, and to understand Lincoln, you have to understand the Lincoln-Douglas debates. In the Lincoln-Douglas debates, he was asked if the Declaration of Independence applied to Black people. And he said, I think the authors of that notable instrument intended to include all men, but they did not mean to declare all men equal in all respects. They did not mean to say all men were equal in color, size, intellect, moral development, or social capacity. He's not saying some men are taller and some men read more. He's saying some men are superior and some are inferior. And he's already made it very abundantly clear which side he thinks is superior. He was asked later about making citizens of Black people. And he says, well, Judge Douglas has asked this question before. He wanted to ask it again. I'm going to tell you very frankly, I am not in favor of Negro citizenship. It's my opinion that the different states have the power to make a Negro citizen under the Constitution if they chose. If the state of Illinois had that power, I would be opposed to the exercise of it. So just to be clear, he is agreeing publicly with the Dred Scott decision. So it's not surprising, right? So as president, he had a question, a dilemma, which is he wanted to end chattel slavery, not because he gave a crap about Black people, because it was causing a black eye for this white supremacist nation and ripping us apart. But now he had a question, what do I do with these Black people who I'm going to free from chattel slavery? He debated sending them back across the ocean. There was a lot of discussion. He ultimately decided to put a clause in the amendment. So it doesn't abolish slavery. It simply redefines and codifies it under the jurisdiction of the criminal justice system. neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party has been duly convicted, shall exist. If you want to know why law enforcement continues to struggle with this treatment of people of color, it's because this is the jurisdiction our Constitution gives our nation to protect white supremacy. Abraham Lincoln was a blatant, unapologetic, self-proclaimed white supremacist until the day he died. But this isn't news to you, right? You knew this. You knew enough about this that you knew not to read the Lincoln-Douglas debates, right? You heard they were bad, but I can't go there. But we know this, right? Who's been to the Lincoln Memorial? At the memorial, there's a museum about half the size of this room. On each wall, there's plaques with quotes and sayings by Abraham Lincoln. They're about the width of that door, maybe about 2 or 3 feet shorter of one of the panels of that door over there. Each wall has writings of Lincoln. One wall has writings, 5 plaques with his thoughts on the Union. Middle of that wall is the plaque that says, "I would save the Union. My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union. It is not to save or destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. If I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. If I could save it by freeing someone, leaving others alone, I would also do that." There is a plaque hanging at the Lincoln Memorial that literally states, according to this man, Black lives don't matter. We know this. We announce it to the globe. We have a freaking temple on the mall stating this. I'm not telling you something you don't know in the depth of your heart. As a result, that's not actually what's going to make you throw the book in chapters 9 and 10. It will piss you off. You'll be mad at me, but it's not going to be what makes you throw the book. What's going to make you throw the book is what's next. In 1862, Abraham Lincoln signed 2 bills: the Homestead Act and the Pacific Railway Act. The Homestead Act allocated 160 acres and was willing to go west and homestead for 5 years. Pacific Railway Act allocated the land and the resources to complete the Transcontinental Railway. This was in the spring and summer of 1862. In the fall of 1862, we had the Dakota War of 1862. Hundreds of people died on both sides. It was a very bloody war. End of the war, half of the Dakota warriors fled north into Canada. The other half surrendered. They were immediately put into trials. End of these trials, it was determined that 400 of them were going to be hanged. The order went all the way up to Lincoln. No one had the guts to execute that order. So they changed, Abraham Lincoln changed the criteria of what warranted a death sentence. He didn't order retrials. He changed the criteria. So now under his new criteria, only 2 of the Dakota were going to die. Now he was afraid his white settlers in Minnesota were going to rebel, which they were already doing. So a second time, he didn't order retrials. He changed the criteria again. Landed on the magic number of 38. That was a palatable number for him. So the day after Christmas, 1862, hundreds of people gathered as the largest mass execution in the history of our country took place with the hanging of the Dakota 38. In January 29 of 1863, this is an anniversary coming up this Sunday. This is from the Smithsonian Magazine. It says, in the frigid dawn of January 29, Segwitch, a leader among the Shoshone of Beaogi, our big river in what is now Idaho, stepped outside his lodge and saw a curious band of fog moving down the bluff towards him across a half-frozen river. The mist was no fog, though. It was steam rising in the sub-zero air from hundreds of U.S. Army foot soldiers, cavalry, and their horses. The army was coming for his people. Over the next 4 hours, the 200 soldiers under Colonel Patrick Connor's command killed 250 or more Shoshone, including at least 90 women, children, and infants. The Shoshone were shot, stabbed, and battered to death. Some were driven into the icy river to drown or freeze. There's a book here, The Bear River Massacre. This is one of the least known massacres in our nation's history, and just the worst massacre in our nation's history. I run what's called on my YouTube channel. It's my second cup of coffee. I have a cup of coffee and do a live stream several times a week. Occasionally I have guests. Yesterday I had Darren Perry, who's the former chairman of the Shoshone Nation, and he's the author of this book, A Bear River Massacre, Shoshone History. Gut-wrenching what our nation did to him, and we don't even talk about it. In February of 1863, Abraham Lincoln nullified the treaties of all the nations in Minnesota, the Native nations. In March of 63, without treaties now or negotiation, he ordered the removal of all the Native peoples from Minnesota. They were put on wagons, they were put on boats, they were marched out, put on barges, they're removed into the Dakota territories. It was a very inhumane, even violent removal. In the fall of 1863, Abraham Lincoln's general gave this command, sorry, this went way too far. Where am I at? In the fall of 1863, General Carleton gave this order to the army captains in New Mexico and said, henceforth, every Navajo male is to be killed or taken prisoner on sight. Say to them, go to the bush Redondo, or we will pursue you and destroy you. We will not make peace with you on any other terms. This war shall be pursued until you cease to exist or you move. There can be no talk on this subject. One of the army captains went through our land. They burned our crops, they destroyed our homes, they butchered our animals, and they chased our people around. By the middle of December, Raymond Friday Locke, in his book, The Navajo, records most of the weak and aged had died. There's hardly a Navajo family that cannot remember tales of an aged grandfather, a pregnant mother, or a lame child that had to be left behind when the camp had to be quickly deserted. The patrols were not interested in taking captives. It was way too much trouble to transport them back to the forts. Any Navajo they saw was shot on sight. Mothers were sometimes forced to suffocate their crying babies to keep their families from being discovered and butchered by an army patrol. They went through our land. They rounded up 10,000 of our Navajo men, women, and children. This is my people. They marched us hundreds of miles to Bush Redondo. Hundreds of our people died of exposure and starvation along the way. And approximately a quarter of the people died while incarcerated in the squalid conditions at this camp. They called it a reservation, but it was really a death camp. A death camp that was approved by Abraham Lincoln in January 15 of 1864. In the summer of 64, he also signed the Pacific Railway Act, the second half, which allocated more land and resources. In the fall of 1864, November, the Cheyenne and Arapaho were on their treaty lands in eastern Colorado. They had a white flag of surrender and an American flag to show they were there peacefully. The U.S. Army, a Union Army led by a Methodist pastor, came over the hill, and he ordered all of them slaughtered. The warriors were out hunting. It was early in the morning. It was men, women, and children there. It was later reported that the soldiers paraded the genitalia of the Native peoples down the streets of Denver in celebration of this massacre. This was November 29. 8 days later, in his annual address, Abraham Lincoln stated that 1.5 million acres were entered under the Homestead Law, and the great enterprise of connecting the Atlantic with the Pacific States by railway and telegraph lines has been entered upon with a vigor that gives assurance of success. This was 8 days later. He's talking about this. It's easier when you see it on a map. This is a map of our country with the transcontinental railway lines. The primary line had reached the central Nebraska, Omaha, Nebraska. It had to go through Nebraska, Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, Nevada, and come out near California. There was a northern route that went through Minnesota, North Dakota, Montana, Idaho, and come out near Seattle, and a southern route going through New Mexico, Arizona, and come out near LA. After the removal of the Dakota and Winnebago from Minnesota, after the Sand Creek Massacre in eastern Colorado, after the Long Walk in the Four Corners area, and after the Bear River Massacre, it's very clear what Abraham Lincoln was doing. He was ethnically cleansing the primary routes of the Transcontinental Railway, making him one of the most genocidal presidents in our nation's history. It's no wonder we have a temple to him on our mall. Christian nationalism celebrates the destruction of the other. I have about 5 more minutes and then we'll be done here. I want to just bring this into the modern day, right? Because the problem is not just Abraham Lincoln. It's that we celebrate him as a nation. He is considered one of our greatest presidents. Not because he ended slavery, he didn't. Because he found a way to thread the needle to keep white supremacy alive and gave us the tools we're using literally last week to keep people of color living in fear and oppressed. If you want to know why we have the highest incarceration rate of any country in the world, you can thank Abraham Lincoln. If you want to know why we incarcerate people of color at 3 to 5 times the rate to white people, you can thank Abraham Lincoln. Now, again, we're having this dialogue on white Christian nationalism. And on June 1st, 2020, we had a more pivotal point, right? We had just had the lynching of George Floyd, and there were protests going on in Lafayette Park right in front of the White House. And that morning, law enforcement went in and they aggressively cleared the park that was protesting police violence. Once the park was cleared, President Trump walked out of the White House, crossed the park, and stood in front of the people. Near this sign, he held up his Bible upside down at first, and he turned it around, took his picture, didn't say much, and walked back. And he was immediately called out for what he was doing, right? This was a dog whistle to white Christian nationalism. And we called him out for it. But again, this is a bipartisan problem. During the 2020 election, Joe Biden promised that he would bring civility back into the White House. He was tired of President Trump doing his foreign policy on Twitter. He was tired of him calling out both our enemies and our allies. He was tired of a simple sentence structure and his bombastic language. And he said, if you elect me, I will bring civility back to the White House. He did get elected, and a year into his presidency, he had a chance to demonstrate that civility when we had a terrorist attack in Afghanistan, which claimed the lives of several U.S. service members at the airport. And in his remarks, Joe Biden said, to those who carried out this attack, as well as anyone who wishes America harm, know this: we will not forgive, we will not forget, we will hunt you down and make you pay. I will defend our interests and our people with every measure at my command. Now, just a couple months ago, everyone was up in arms because President Putin said something very similar, right? I will defend my nation. And we said, oh, you're a nuclear power. How can you talk that way? You are so irresponsible. What are you doing? When a year ago, Joe Biden said the exact same thing, which is very similar to things President Trump said the 4 years before that. If I didn't tell you Joe Biden gave that quote, you probably would have thought it would have come from Trump or another Republican president. But Joe Biden didn't even stop there. He went on to thank the commanders and the people in the field for helping bring this to a resolution. And then he said, those who have served through the ages have drawn inspiration from the book of Isaiah, when the Lord says, whom shall I send and who shall go for us? And the American military has been answering for a long time, here am I, Lord, send me. Here I am, send me. In his State of the Union, Joe Biden referred to or used the word sacred twice. He used it once in reference to the Capitol. This is a sacred space. He also used it in reference to our sacred obligation to take better care of our veterans. I do not disagree. We have an absolute moral obligation to take better care of our veterans, but Biden used the term sacred. Why does he bring in the aspect of the divine? Because he believes the U.S. military is the army of the Lord, responding to a prophetic call on par with that of Isaiah the prophet. If you think white Christian nationalism is a bipartisan problem, I beg of you to turn off CNN and MSNBC. They're not going to tell you this. It would destroy their advertising. And Fox News doesn't have the theological acumen to make this kind of analysis. We have to be aware of what we're being told and what we're being fed, right? White Christian nationalism is a bipartisan value that was written into the foundations of our nation and has created a dysfunctional theological imagination for all U.S. citizens. I am convinced that the United States of America needs a national dialogue on race, gender, and class. It's a conversation I would put on par with the Truth and the Reconciliation Commissions that took place in South Africa, in Rwanda, and in Canada. But I would not call ours truth and reconciliation, because reconciliation implies there was a previous harmony, which isn't accurate. I would use the term conciliation, which is about mediating a dispute. There's an author, or a leader named George Erasmus. He's a native leader from what's now called Canada. And a few years ago, he was writing about the truth and reconciliation they were having there regarding boarding schools. And while I mentioned boarding schools, I want to just highlight one thing for you, because they asked me to point out how the Presbyterian Church is complicit in all of this. A few years ago, they found mass graves all around North American continent with bodies of children from boarding schools. Government and religious boarding schools established for the express purpose of forcibly assimilating Native children to white European Christian culture. They were stolen from their homes, put into military-style boarding schools, punished for speaking their languages, punished for practicing their culture. The stories of abuse I've heard personally from survivors regarding the emotional, mental, physical, and sexual abuse they endured is gut-wrenching. And the last of these schools didn't close until the 1970s and 80s. A few years ago, they found a grave site in Albuquerque, New Mexico. It was not marked. Someone actually found a skull of a child in the park. They reported that it was walking through the park. Kids unearthed a metal sculpture and stepped on the marker that hints to the unmarked grave site below for students of an old Albuquerque Indian school who had died there more than 100 years ago. Draped on a solitary tree nearby were orange tapestries, part of a community-built memorial dedicated to the grave site near the former site of the Albuquerque Indian School. The Albuquerque Indian School was opened by the Presbyterian Church 2 years after the first Indian school opened in Pennsylvania. It was run by your church. George Erasmus had this quote that he was using when he was writing about truth and conciliation. And he said, where common memory is lacking, where people don't share in the same past, there can be no real community. If you want to build a community, he said, you have to start by creating common memory. I love this quote. I think it gets to the heart of our nation's problem, especially with race, which is we don't have a common memory. We have a white majority that remembers this mythological legacy of discovery and expansion, opportunity and exceptionalism, and have communities of color that have the lived experience of stolen lands and broken treaties, of enslavement and Jim Crow laws, of internment camps, of segregation and mass incarceration, families being ripped apart at our borders, and there's no common memory. And there's actually no point in our nation's history where we can look back and say we had a healthy relationship across racial lines. I'm not teaching this material to make you feel ashamed. I'm not teaching this material to cancel or silence anybody. I am trying to create common memory, because I want to live in a nation that has a healthy community. And the role of the church in this is not to lead this. The church can't lead this process. The church created the environment. It's no mistake that my co-author of this book on Southern Truth wrote a previous book called Prophetic Lament, where he points out the anemic ability of the Western church to lament. If you want to be a part of this dialogue, if you want to be a part of this healing, I don't need your confession right now. I don't need your statements of rejection. I need the church in America to lament. Lament is about sitting in the brokenness and allowing the depth of the brokenness to be impacted on your heart. And don't flee from lament in 5 minutes or an hour or even a week, as you're going to be tempted to do. Sit in lament until Creator shows up. And according to the scriptures, when the people of God lament, God always shows up. He doesn't come quickly. But when he does, when Creator comes, Creator shows a way forward that is unexpected for anyone else was thinking. I'm so grateful to be here with you today. As I said, I have copies of the signed book in the back. One of the things I'm offering right now is if you buy 10 copies of Unsettling Truths, they're all signed. If you bought one earlier today, they weren't signed, bring them to the back and I'll sign them for you. But there's signed copies. If you buy 10 books for the purpose of a book study at your church or with your congregation, we will get your email address. And I'll let you schedule with me anytime in the next year a 45-minute Q&A for your study. We'll do it over Zoom, and it will allow us to have some conversation with your study about questions they have about what they're reading in there. I am so thrilled that you invited me to be here. I know I went over time. There's so much material here, but I hope this is helpful. I thank you for your willingness to wrestle with this material. I thank you for your willingness to engage with this history. I hope that you will join me in creating this common memory. And I invite you into this pathway of lament as we seek to try to find what our next steps are and where we need to go from here. Shout out my Creator, all right, my friends. Thank you.
I was joking with someone during the break, and I said, you know what, I'm just going to stand up and say, I totally disagree with everything that Mark Charles has said, but that's not the case. But in some sense, I have nothing to say. I have nothing to say, in some sense. I'm not white. I'm not Native American. I have no white guilt. I have no personal pain because I'm Native American. So in that narrow sense, I really have nothing to say. But in some sense, I do have something to say. I live on this land, the Piscataway land. I'm a naturalized citizen of the U.S. And the way I think of being naturalized is like being adopted. If you get adopted by a family, you inherit the blessings, but you also inherit its problems. And so I do have something to say, but at a deeper level, Mark, me, all of us, we are believers in Jesus. And we are Americans. And so in a narrow sense, I'm not personally related to the story of Mark and his family and his heritage, but at a faith level, we are connected. And so that Christian story, beginning with Jesus all the way to the now, is our story. And our story is mixed. And if we do our story right, where there's been wrongs and injustices, you get an opportunity to address it, not maybe fix it, but maybe bring some healing. And so it's with that thought, I just make some comments. Maybe like a lot of you, if you're interested in a topic, you make Amazon very rich. I start buying books left and right. And there is a book I recommend if you want to follow the impact of the Doctrine of Discovery in New Zealand, Australia, and Canada. I get this book, Discovering Indigenous Lands. That decision of 1823, Johnson and McIntosh, became a precedent principle of law that in New Zealand, Australia, Canada use to continue their own sort of subjugation of the indigenous people and their displacement. So this decision of 1823 has had a powerful impact. And in 2007, when the UN passed the rights of the indigenous people, it passed by the vote of 143 to 4. The 4 nations that are opposed were Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the US. And the commonality is that in all these 4, there is a large population of indigenous people still. And so this is not an ancient problem. This is not something historic. It's something that we live with. Now, by profession, I'm not a historian. And by profession, I'm kind of a theologian, but not really. But I don't need to be a historian or theologian to respond to Mark and his book. And the response I have is one of wanting to work towards that common memory. I totally agree with that, not request, but that imperative. I think, especially in America, in the church, unless we have a common memory, we don't have a common language with which to talk about justice, injustice, healing. And so the thoughts I have is to one lament. I think Mark and his friend Sung Chan, by the way, who's a personal friend, it's kind of interesting that you have a Korean American guy speaking and a Korean American guy co-authoring, you know. But again, the commonality has nothing to do with, in this particular case, race or ethnicity or whatever story. It has to do with our identity in Jesus and the fact that we are living here as American citizens. There is something, not so much I disagree with Mark, but I just want your response to it. You make the following stance in the book that the white American church cannot lead this. And you tell a kind of revealing story. It's like a man who lives next door to another family and he's sleeping with a woman of the next door neighbor. And the next door neighbor is recognizing a marital crisis. So the guy approaches a ministry in the neighborhood and the pastor says, oh, we have a small group. We have ministry for people whose marriages are having difficulty. In fact, your neighbor is the head of the ministry group. And Mark says in here, well, he's got nothing to say. His job is to get out of bed. Stop sleeping with that woman. Now, when I read that, I mean, that resonated. But the thought I have is not so much who must lead, but who should be involved, you know? And so, again, it's more an idea. If it happens to be the case that a white Presbyterian church, white person leads some of these discussions, my naive thought is, why not? I think the main thing is to get this conversation going. Now, if this conversation arises from different quarters, be it my friend Sung Chan, who's Korean American, be with somebody else, in my perspective, it really doesn't matter. I think the great challenge is to develop a common memory, which is listening to each other's history and story. These are, what I do like about Mark is it's not his opinion. These are all documented, and it's hard. When he and I talked, I knew the sacred cow was Abraham Lincoln. Even in my own mind, I go, oh my goodness, this is the one person you don't attack. When I visit the Lincoln Memorial, it is like going to church when you're there in the evening. And for him to go to the source of some of the heartaches and injustices is in the service of speaking the truth. And so in terms of my own response, one is to thank you, Mark, for it. And perhaps you could address that my thought. Does it really matter who leads the conversation? Now, before I have him speak, I do have some resources to share with you. In 2016, the National Capital Presbytery made an overture during the General Assembly to look into the Doctrine of Discovery. And a report was presented in 2018 at the 223rd General Assembly. This document is available, downloadable. This is the best thing I read that's short, precise, and it also includes recommendations for churches and the presbyteries. And so this very presbytery was stirred enough to have the church address it. So I recommend that. There are some other books for history buffs. There's an older book called The New England Frontier, Puritans and Indians, 1620 to 1675, Alden Vaughan, that gets into the Puritans' relationship with Native Americans from 1620 to 75. And basic presentation, it was peaceable for those 55 years, respectful, but then the War of 1675 totally changed. Okay, and so that's another book. There is what's called a New Indian School of History. There is a man who's teaching in Oxford. He's from Finland. The book is called The Indigenous Continent. His first name is Pekka, last name is Hamaladin, and he talks about the history of the Native Americans here, the Sioux, the Lakotas, and the Comanche. The last book I recommend, and it's a terrific read, it's called The Empire of the Summer Moon by S.C. Gwynn. It's about the Comanche Empire. There's a reason why the coasts were populated first by European settlers, and not in the middle, not in the Southern Plains. And it's because of the Comanches. And so you have a variety of reading. I just recommend that you read, think. I think this important topic deserves not just the day, not just the week, but if you're like me, spend some time reading, soaking, praying, and perhaps asking God, what can we do? So Mark, thank you so much. And if you could just answer my thought or suggestion. Thank you.
Who to lead this conversation? That is a very good question. And I think there's a lot of things that in our nation, we don't know where to find this leadership. And how do we address these things in our history when literally our nation doesn't have the integrity? I moved from Denver, Colorado, where I was pastoring a church, back to the Navajo Nation. I had grown up in a border town to the Navajo Nation because my grandparents were boarding school survivors. My father didn't know the language to teach it to me, so I didn't know it. I attended a school. It was actually used to be a boarding school run by my denomination, the Christian Reformed Church. I was there when it was transitioning from a boarding school to a day school. I wasn't there as a boarding school student. I was there as a day school student. And so I grew up off of my reservation, not knowing my culture, not knowing my language. And so as an adult, I moved back to the Navajo Nation. And I wanted to experience the life of my people. And so our family, it was my wife and myself and our son at that time. And we moved into a remote community on the reservation. We were 6 miles off the nearest paved road on a dirt road. We were on a sheep camp. Our neighbors were rug weavers and shepherds. And when we moved there, we were prepared to live off the grid, right? My website is Wireless Hogan. One of the reasons I use Wireless Hogan is because we lived in a wireless Hogan. There were no wires there. There was no electricity. There was no running water. We were completely off the grid. But this was in 2004, and they were just coming out with wireless technology, and I could hang my cell phone from the rafters of my Hogan. I could tether it to my laptop. I could charge my laptop in my car, and I could get on the internet at 1x speed, which is pretty slow. So I had a wireless network in my wireless Hogan. And so we chose the name Wireless Hogan for my website. But we moved there prepared to live off the grid. We moved there to haul our water and to herd sheep and to live by candlelight and to use the outhouse 50 yards outside the Hogan. We moved there prepared for that. What we weren't prepared for was how completely marginalized our community was. It felt like we dropped off the face of the earth. I quickly observed that and literally we fell to his earth. I could count on one hand the number of white people that visited us in our Hogan the first 2 years we were there, including relatives and friends. One hand. I quickly observed that the only non-natives we saw living on the reservation were those who came to give us charity and those who came to take our picture. Often they were the same people. And while I was there, I was experiencing the historical trauma, both the PTSD, the complex PTSD, and the historical trauma of my people and the way it was affecting them mentally and physically, relationally, the families and everything else. I was learning about the history and the doctrine of discovery, and I was feeling marginalized, and I was becoming very, very, very angry. And I was trying to sort through it, and all of my friends were people who lived off the reservation. We lived in a very remote community, and it was incredibly isolated. We spent a lot of time alone. And I was trying to sort through this with my friends. And every time I would bring it up and start talking about it, I could feel the anger coming up in me. And I'd have to hang up the phone or stop the conversation so I would not yell at my friends. So I learned how to temper myself. I learned how to talk about this stuff like I was reading it in the newspaper. I could emotionally disconnect from it, which let me stay in the conversation longer. But the longer I was in the conversation, then the more my friends got upset. It wasn't my family who did that to you. It wasn't my community who did that to you. And soon they would hang up the phone. And I did not know how to have this dialogue about our history where I could be honest about what I was feeling and be engaging with people who weren't part of my community. And so one day, it was like the 10th time I'm trying to get my friends to understand how I'm feeling. And I said to them, I said, living on the Navajo reservation in the midst of this country, it feels like our native communities is this old grandmother who has a very large and a very beautiful house. And years ago, some people came into our house and they locked us upstairs in the bedroom. Today, our house is full of people. They're sitting on our furniture, they're eating our food, they're having a party inside our house. Now, they've since come upstairs and they've unlocked the door to our bedroom, but it's much later. We're tired, we're old, we're weak, we're sick, so we can't or we don't come out. But the thing that hurts us the most, what causes us the most pain, is that virtually nobody from this party ever comes upstairs, seeks out the grandmother in the bedroom, sits down next to her on the bed, takes her hand, and simply says, "Aha, thank you." I said, that's how I feel. I started sharing that with people around me, other members of my community. And I had some people come to me and say, I've lived here all my life, Mark. I've struggled to know how to articulate how it feels, and you're hitting the nail on the head. I started sharing that with my white friends. And instead of getting angry, instead of getting defensive, they would come back and say, how do we say thank you? How does my family, my church, my city, my state, my nation express gratitude to the indigenous peoples of Turtle Island? See, now we're having a very different conversation. Now, instead of talking about victim versus oppressor, now we're talking about what I think is the heart of the problem, which is we have a reversal of roles. We have a dominant white nation that came over here. They never asked for, nor were they ever given permission to be here. And now they're living here like they own the place. Meanwhile, we have native communities who have been here long before that. Our creation stories place us here. And we're being treated like unwanted guests in someone else's house. We have a reversal of roles. I'm working very hard to help the uninvited guests in my house. And I don't care if you came over on the Mayflower or you jumped a fence last week. I'm trying to help the uninvited guests in my house, in our house, to understand in some very real and practical ways they are guests in someone else's house. And I'm trying to help my native community understand in some very real and practical ways we are the host people of the land. I had the chance to, there's several books I would want to recommend to you. One is the book Prophetic Lament, I've already showed you. Another one is this book, The Land Is Not Empty, by Sarah Augustine. And Sarah Augustine is a native woman. She's living on the Yakima Reservation, and she wrote this book about the Doctrine of Discovery. I highly recommend it. There's another book by an author called Pagans in the Promised Land by Stephen Newcomb, and he's a native author and has done some incredible work looking at the implications of the Doctrine of Discovery. And one of the stories, I had the honor of writing the foreword for this book, and one of the stories I tell is the story of getting to know a shepherd on the Hogan where we used to live. And this man was a boarding school survivor. He spoke better Navajo than English. He was raised on that sheep camp. It was his family's camp since after they returned from the long walk. And I was out herding sheep with him one day. And as we were herding sheep, this was back in 2004, 2005, right? George Bush was in office, and we were just beginning to have a dialogue about comprehensive immigration reform. And I said to my friend, I said, the nation's talking about this. I'm curious, what are your thoughts? What do you think we need to do about immigration reform? And my friend, who has a third grade education, he said, well, there's already so many of them here. Maybe we should just not worry about borders anymore. Maybe we should just tear down the borders. Now, if you're anywhere else in the country, you immediately think that he's talking about the southern border and the 12 million undocumented immigrants who have crossed down there. But because we're both native, because we're on a reservation, because he's a boarding school survivor, you have to pause and ask, is he talking about the 12 million or the 300 million who have been crossing our borders since 500 years ago? And I love the ambiguity so much I didn't even bother to ask him to clarify. I just left it there. And I began talking and teaching and telling people, groups I'm connected with, CCDA and Sojourners and the Christian Reformed Church. I said, if you are advocating for comprehensive and just immigration reform, you have to understand that without Native Americans at the table, our nation is incapable of comprehensively and justly reforming immigration law. Without natives at the table, all you have is one generation of undocumented immigrants trying to figure out what to do with another generation of undocumented immigrants, and there is no integrity in the dialogue. Now, these organizations I mentioned loved it. And they invited me to speak, and they published my articles, and they were thrilled to put me on stage up until the day that the Gang of Eight proposed a bipartisan bill for comprehensive and just immigration law. At that moment, immediately, all my invitations, all the goodwill from the organizations dried up. Because now the depth I was trying to take the conversation to was blocking the legislation they were lobbying to pass. And now I was a distraction. I was a hindrance to their work instead of a help to their work. And so I truly believe, right, if we want to address some of these challenges, we have to find a way to listen to the wisdom of our indigenous peoples, people who have been living here for hundreds, thousands of years, right? Standing Rock. I loved Standing Rock. It was a gathering, an unprecedented gathering of hundreds of Native nations, tens of thousands of indigenous peoples coming together, peacefully protesting, committed to nonviolence, committed to prayer, and telling our colonizers that you cannot drink oil and that water is life. Working hard to educate this nation. What does it mean and look like to live sustainably within this land? So if we want to lead this conversation, we have to understand that the vast majority of people, and our nation likes to call itself a nation of immigrants, right? We love to say that. And we do that for very specific reasons, because it keeps the myth of American exceptionalism alive, right? This land was empty. We're all immigrants here. Well, when we're immigrants, we actually ignore two primary groups of people, right? We ignore natives who didn't immigrate here, and we ignore African Americans who were never immigrants here. They were kidnapped, brought here, and enslaved. And you want to know the depths we go through to keep this narrative alive? We've had two prominent African Americans in national office, the White House and the vice presidency, and guess what? Neither one of them were the direct descendants of slaves, enslaved people in this nation. Both Vice President Harris and President Obama keep the myth alive that we're all immigrants. I'm not blaming them. I'm just telling white people, don't feel so charitable about who you put in office. There's reasons why you do these things. There's reasons why you select these people. And it's because you are working with every fiber of your being to keep this myth alive. And so if we want to have this kind of dialogue, we need to do what we're doing right now. If you know Deb Haaland, I love Deb Haaland. She's the Secretary of the Interior. She's literally traveling the country right now, collecting stories of indigenous boarding school survivors. She was just on My Nation, the Navajo Nation, a few weeks ago. She's gathering these stories as the Secretary of the Interior, trying to move this conversation, trying to inch it forward. And so I deeply, deeply believe, John, the answer to your question is, if we want to have an in-depth dialogue, if we want to have an in-depth conversation, the church can't lead it. White power establishment can't lead it. We need to elevate the indigenous peoples of the land and allow this community to step into our role as the host people of this land, so that we can have this conversation. I appreciate your question, John. Thank you for that. I know I'm happy to stay a little later if we need to, but
thank you.
I know we have a lot of questions.
Thank you. We won't get through them all, but I do. If you can just, give us the kind of elevator speech for a couple of these, and if there is no elevator speech, just do what you do. Okay. How's that? Creating common memories is necessary. And listening to many voices is essential. But what other actions do we need to move towards forgiveness and the ability to move forward with this common memory building? And particularly the role that indigenous peoples play in that, which you've already alluded to.
Yeah. So one of the challenges we're going to face, and I usually put this in my lecture, but I didn't have space to do it. So this is not going to be an elevator speech. I'm sorry. Well, we'll go to the top of the Empire State Building. It'll be a long elevator speech. So one of the challenges we face as a nation is we don't know how to have this conversation. And the biggest challenge is we don't know what to do with white people in this dialogue. White people are some of the most disruptive voices in this conversation. And we don't know what to do with them. And we actually have two paradigms we put white people in. One is the paradigm of fragility, right? After the lynching of George Floyd, Robin DiAngelo's book, White Fragility, shot to the top of the bestseller list and stayed there for a long time. And Robin has some great insight into the psyche behind whiteness. And she talks about it very well and identifies a few things. But I wrestle with her paradigm of fragility, because if something's fragile, right? If it's fragile, if I'm helping someone move and I see a box mark fragile, I have one of two choices. I can obey the sign, pick it up gently and carefully lay it in the truck, or I can ignore the sign. Oh, I saw them pack this box. There's just towels in there. I can throw it in the truck, not knowing they packed their china, and find glasses underneath the towels at the bottom of the box, and I can intentionally break them. That's your choice when something's fragile. The other option is, the other paradigm we have is white people are racist, right? You're racist. You lack pigmentation in your skin, you're racist. Now, the challenge with this paradigm is it leaves no space for white people to join the conversation. If you're racist just because you lack pigmentation in your skin, anytime you disagree with me, I have to treat it as a threat. I have to defend myself or even go on the offense against you. If you're racist just because you're white, it means you have nothing to add to the dialogue, and there's no point to including you. Now, that's not helpful. And so the challenge is what do we do? After I would speak on this event years ago, I would go out and give lectures just like I gave to you similarly. And after my presentations, I would have two lines in front of me. One would be a line of people of color. And they were serious but giddy, right? They were like, I didn't know all the dates or all the policies or all the names, but I knew the history was that bad. Thank you for confirming I'm not a conspiracy theorist. And thank you for giving me material to confront the people who disagree with me now. And then I would have a line of white people, and their faces, surprisingly, were white, like a sheet. And they would come up and say one of two things. I had no idea the history was that bad. Tell me how to fix it. And I was telling my colleagues, I've done some research in the psych field, and I was telling some colleagues and thinking to myself, I'm like, you know, I can swear I'm observing trauma in white people, right? So when we understand trauma, when I say trauma, immediately the thought that comes to your mind is PTSD. PTSD is an individual diagnosis for someone who's experienced a single horrifying event. It affects you mentally, physically, emotionally, relationally. It's this all-encompassing condition, but it's a single diagnosis from a single event. So most people think of a PTSD when I say trauma. There's another trauma called a complex PTSD, which doesn't come from a single event, it comes from a series of events. So if you get PTSD from being assaulted, you get complex PTSD from living in an abusive relationship. If you get PTSD from being in a battle, you get complex PTSD from living in a war zone. Psychologists don't know how it works, but they've observed the symptoms of the complex PTSD being passed down generationally. They see it in the children and grandchildren of those who experience the trauma. Now, there's a third trauma. This was observed by a Native American psychologist, and she came up with what she called HTR, or historical trauma. Historical trauma is not an individual diagnosis. It's actually how psychologists understand the dissatisfaction in a broad community. It was first observed in Native communities after boarding schools. You can see it in African American communities after enslavement and segregation and Jim Crow. You can see it in Japanese American communities after internment camps. You can see it in Jewish communities after the Holocaust. I refer to historical trauma as a multi-generational communal manifestation of a complex PTSD. That make sense? So by understanding this, I can prepare for my audiences of color when I go into my speeches. I can be aware of the PTSD, the complex PTSD, and the historical trauma that exists there. And I can make sure I don't trigger them, or I make them aware of the triggers, and I help them understand what's going to be happening. And I can address those issues or just make sure I'm navigating through them as I'm giving my presentation. But again, the most disruptive demographic in these speeches are not people of color, it's white people. And again, most of the time we classify white people as fragile or as racist. So if they're fragile, I have to smooth everything over. If they're racist, I have to defend or go on the offensive against them. So as I was wrestling with this, I actually went to one of my colleagues and we sat down for like a day and I laid out all my observations. We looked at research, we watched videos, we called people, we had an in-depth conversation about, am I observing trauma in white people? Because I could have swore I saw trauma in my white audiences, but I didn't know how to categorize it. It wasn't a PTSD or a complex PTSD or historical trauma. And I laid this all out for my colleague, and at the end of our day together, he said, Mark, when you walked in my door, I was skeptical, but you've convinced me you're observing trauma, but like you, I have no idea how to classify it. So at least I knew I wasn't crazy, but I didn't know what to do with it yet. A few months later, I found this book by Rachel McNair. It's called Perpetration-Induced Traumatic Stress: The Psychological Consequences of Killing. And she was looking at the question of what happens when society gives you the right to take a life. At any level, medical, law enforcement, military. When society gives you the right to take a life, what does that do to you psychologically? And she found it produces what she termed PITS, a perpetration-induced traumatic stress, which she said had all the symptomatology of a PTSD, except instead of afflicting the victims of the traumatic experience, PITS afflict the perpetrator. So once I had her research, I could now make a hypothesis and say if PTSD has a multi-generational communal manifestation at a complex level that afflicts people of color, might not PITS have a multi-generational and communal manifestation at a complex level, which is the trauma I'm observing in white Americans. Now, I didn't want to research this and prove it and go on the academic debate about all this, but now that I had this hypothesis, I could try developing some tools to treat my white audiences as another group of traumatized people. And guess what? It worked. Prior to that, 0.5% of my white audience would be so triggered by what I was saying, they would stand up in the middle of my presentation and call me a liar. To my face. I wasn't trying to prove to my audiences that they're traumatized. I was just trying to keep them in their seats, right? And I found that treating them as traumatized, the first symptom of trauma is shock and denial. I mean, this is self-explanatory, right? Why is CRT such a huge issue? Shock and denial. We don't want to hear the stories of the marginalized telling us this is systemic problems, right? Shock and denial. This explains so much. And so I began developing tools in my presentations, not to convince white people they're traumatized, but just to treat them as traumatized and to train people of color how to treat white people as traumatized. Now, I have to be very, very clear. White people are not victims of trauma. This is a perpetration-induced traumatic stress at a multi-generational and communal and complex level. But you react to these things just as a traumatized person would. And I found that by treating my white audiences as traumatized, A, it lets me get through my presentations without anyone calling me a liar. And B, it actually gives me the tools I need to engage in the dialogue. If someone is fragile and I say something and I see them as fragile and it upsets them, right, I have to smooth it over. If you're in your friends and family who notice you're traumatized first, right? It's an unconscious thing. And if they can convince you to see a counselor and you go into your counselor and the first thing they're doing is they're asking you these broad leading questions and they're trying to get you to talk, they're looking for your triggers, right? A trigger is a sight, a sound, a smell, something that takes you out of reality and back into the moment of chaos that the traumatic experience occurred. Once you're back there, your adrenaline starts pumping, your mouth becomes dry, you go into fight or flight mode, right? So if I trigger someone who's white and I view them as fragile, my inclination is going to be to smooth it over. But if I understand they're traumatized, my inclination is going to be, okay, let's keep you safe and let's keep me safe. But then at the end of this thing, either the next day or right after, let's come back and say, okay, we have to talk about that. That was unusual, right? Let's discuss why this threw you into a fit of rage. And we can actually discuss it. And so I've literally found by treating my white audiences as another group of traumatized people, I'm not doing their work for them. It lets me do the work I'm trying to do. And it actually gives me some tools to bring the conversation further than I brought it before. And I think this is the challenge we're facing. This is why we don't have common memory, is because our white people are still in the state of shock and denial. And anytime they hear these things that come up, they either repress them, they go into a fit of rage against them, or they do something to disrupt the conversation so we can't go deeper. And so again, this book is I love Rachel McNair. She's been on my second cup of coffee before, and we've had some great conversations. Her research is vastly important in the work I'm trying to do. But that's a great question. So I'm sorry that was not, I think we're at the top floor of the Empire State Building now. We have to go back down again. But yeah, that was thank you for asking that question.
This is a direct follow-up. And that is that we are still a white dominant denomination. We have churches, congregations that are not, and we have certain parts of the country, in fact, that may not be. But this question comes from, steps that we need to take to face our own white supremacy that we've inherited. And just as an example, I mean, I'm named after a Confederate War veteran. I went to Robert E. Lee High School. I mean, I was raised in a very racist paradigm, even though it was sort of, they thought benign or paternalistic. And I struggle with that inside myself all the time. I do it most fruitfully by retelling my family narrative, discovering that one of our, ancestors was married to a Cherokee, or was that code for a Black person, which was not uncommon down in the South. And so we're trying to recover that family history in a broader way. Are there ways that we can engage in that individually or communally?
Yeah.
And lamentation comes to mind as one piece of that that you mentioned earlier. Yeah. But what are constructive ways that we can do that?
So one of the reasons I chose to deconstruct Lincoln in this presentation instead of just the general history is because we're getting better at calling out the South, right? They lost the war, and we don't like losers in our country. And so they lost the war, they broke the trend, so we can call out Confederate generals, we can call out the South. I wanted to highlight Abraham Lincoln because we all celebrate Lincoln. Right. To be honest, I'm more offended by the Lincoln Memorial than I am by a statue of Robert E. Lee. I'm deeply offended by the memorial to Abraham Lincoln. I'm deeply offended of his views on Black people. I'm deeply offended of his genocidal policies towards Native peoples. And this is where we have to deal with it. And so this is the problem, right? We're like, this is what we do. This is what our two-party political system does. This is what our media does. Let's find the loser and let's make them the villain. So Robert E. Lee, right? If we could just get rid of his statues, we'd be fine. I'm like, what about this temple that we all worship at to Abraham Lincoln, who I would actually argue is worse? And we don't address that. So we have to not let ourselves be fooled that our two-party political system and our binary thinking and our deeply colonial church is going to be able to lead us in a dialogue that gets to the heart of the matter. And we have to instead, this is why lament is so beautiful. Lament is not about repentance. Lament is not about asking for forgiveness. Lament is about sitting in the brokenness and letting the depth of the brokenness be immersed in it. Sing-Chan describes lament in his book as it's like going to a funeral dirge, right? You don't go there to raise someone from the dead. You go there to grieve. You go there to mourn. You go there to weep. I tell audiences all the time, it's almost impossible to lament when you believe in the myth of your own exceptionalism. There's no space to lament. You have to be exceptional. Lament implies you're not. And so this is where we need to allow ourselves. I call the church not to a service of lament, right? And we can't even get through Good Friday, the most lamentable thing in the Christian calendar. We can't even get through the end of that service without saying, well, Friday's here, but Sunday's coming, right? We can't even walk out of the service and lament. We have to have something to cling to, because there has to be something that says there's hope beyond this. So imagine how the disciples felt Saturday morning. You felt like crap, right? You had no hope or expectation this guy was going to come back to life. You abandoned him at the cross. Saturday must have been absolutely horrible, but we can't go there. So we're like, okay, well, Sunday's coming. We know Sunday's coming. So let's just hold our breath through Saturday. We don't know how to lament. And so I call the church not to be in a service or a period or even of lament. We have to go into a season of lament, because who changes the seasons? Creator does. We have to stay in lament until Creator shows up, and allow Creator to show us the way out of lament. And you read the scriptures, right? Creator does not come quickly. Creator let people lament much longer than they were comfortable with. And so, yeah, another book I want to recommend is this book here. It's called Voices of Lament. It's like 30 or 40 women of color sharing stories, poems, liturgies of lament. And if you want a teacher, a professor in how to lament, women of color is the group you need to go to. So several of my friends wrote parts for this book. I highly recommend it. I'll leave these books up front afterwards if you want to come take pictures of them. But this is where we want to enter this dialogue. We need to go through the period of lament. Thank you.
Where can we go to learn more about your call for Truth and Conciliation Commission?
So I ran for president in 2020. Most of you don't know that, but it's because I actually wanted to run for president. I didn't want to campaign to white landowning men, so I didn't run as a Democrat or a Republican, where they both run their primaries through Iowa and New Hampshire. Iowa is the 5th whitest state in the country. New Hampshire is the 3rd. Iowa has the highest percentage of private lands. New Hampshire has the highest percentage of land of home ownership. So both parties, if you want to be president and get through the party primaries, you have to spend a year campaigning to white landowning men in Iowa and New Hampshire. And I didn't want to do that. So I ran as an independent, which means no one heard of me. Literally, the press wrote me out of stories. They would not include me. You want to learn about my campaign, Google Mark Charles and Elizabeth Warren. Just Google those 2 names. You'll get an article from the Native American forum they had in Iowa in August of 2019. The article is titled, "Elizabeth Warren was well received at the Native Forum, but Mark Charles was the main event." Ran an Esquire. Which means when the press reported it, we had something to say, right? After the lynching of George Floyd, Donald Trump said, reluctantly, maybe we might want to think about banning certain types of chokeholds. Joe Biden had the brilliant idea of training officers to shoot people in the kneecaps instead of in the chest. Literally, that was his suggestion. Of course, none of that helped Jacob Blake. A few months later, was shot in the back several times. I was the only candidate who said, well, why don't we take the clause out of the 13th Amendment and remove the constitutional protection for white supremacy in our foundations? No one wanted to talk about that, right? No one wanted to have that conversation. And so this is, if you Google Mark Charles and Navajo, or Mark Charles and We the People, you will find a plethora of articles I've written, of videos I've done, of interviews I've done, of podcasts I've done. I have been working for over a decade to try and raise the dialogue. I tell people I'm the most famous person you've never heard of, right? In 2009, President Obama signed House Resolution 3326, the 2010 Department of Defense Appropriations Bill. Laid out the appropriations, 48-page document laying out the appropriations for the DoD for 2006. Page 45, subsection 8113, was titled Apology to Native Peoples of the United States. What follows was a 7-bullet point apology. Mentioned no specific tribe, no specific treaty, no specific injustice. It said you had some nice lands, our citizens didn't take it very politely, let's just now call it all of our land and we'll steward it together. Then it ended with a disclaimer saying nothing in here is legally binding. I was appalled. I hosted a public reading of that apology on the Capitol grounds. I sent a letter to the White House. I hand-delivered letters to Congress members and senators. I invited state representatives and business leaders and religious leaders from all over the country. They all declined to come. They all had excuses. I even got a letter from the White House saying President Obama or anyone on his staff that's going to be there. The only people who showed up were people from the grassroots. And we read the apology. So the point of all this is there is a lot of work that needs to be done. I, along with many other people, have been working to engage this dialogue. And so if you Google Mark Charles and Navajo, Navajo is how we spell it, you will find a lot of resources on me online. On YouTube, there's a lot of stuff out there. So yeah, there's a lot of work I do. I'm on YouTube. I have Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. I have a website. I'm also on Patreon, which is where I take the conversation even deeper for people who subscribe to me on Patreon. So I'm doing everything I can to engage this at a much deeper level. And there's even still a lot of resources out there about my 2020 campaign. I'm convinced if they had an award for the best announcement video, we would have won. We would have won. Hands down, we would have won. I had people emailing me in tears saying, I just watched your video and I want to support you. But yeah, so all that stuff is still online and you can find it still. Thanks for that question.
One final question, it's conglomerate. There are a number of questions about specific historical incidents. And I'm going to take them as, is there anything to learn from these in changing minds and changing hearts? The encounter of Frederick Douglass with Lincoln, did that make a dent? The role of some Spanish missionaries in Latin America and especially South America, where minds and hearts were changed as to trying to grant them legal status, as human beings, whereas others did not want to. Some early Puritans and their attempts to engage peacefully with the Algonquin mission and that period John was. Are there anything to learn in the past that is otherwise so very dehumanizing? Are there points of light that we should try to find, or is that going to just assuage our guilt? You know what I mean?
I don't have the title of the article at the forefront of my mind. I wrote a blog post probably over a decade ago. I saw a post by Pope Francis So maybe not, a little less than a decade ago, maybe like 7 or 8 years ago. It was a tweet by Pope Francis, who talked about something about Jesus was the servant and he endured persecution, something that talking about how Jesus was calling to live the life as the least. And Miroslav Volf responded to his tweet and said, yes, he did that, but he also had all this power and all this authority and blah, blah, blah. And I wrote a blog post and I compared this to if Pope Francis was Goliath and Miroslav Volf was David, I was like the fly who was stuck in David's lunch. You know, I'm not even on the stage here. But I said, this is the problem, is we get these deeply hard truths. And we're constantly looking for the exception. And the reason we do that is because Western culture is hyper-individualistic. Hyper-individualistic. And so it uses that to preserve itself. So if you can find the exception that breaks the rule, you can now set a precedent that goes along with that. And so I said, what if we stopped looking for the exceptions to justify ourselves and we actually just accepted the rule? And so, yes, I could give any one of you could name numerous exceptions about how these things were addressed, or individual places where this happened, or things that took place, and that will allow you to fall asleep quicker tonight, which is what you're thinking about when you're looking for those exceptions. But I say, if we just accept the rule as a rule and don't find the exceptions, don't seek the exceptions, then we actually have to deal with the problem. And that's what we need to do. And so this is the challenge, and this is the way. So I could give you a number of examples, but we so often use that to escape. I mean, even just before this session, right? Someone said to me in our planning session, they said, if you could highlight 1 or 2 ways to find a way that the Presbyterian Church is complicit in this. Okay. It took me 30 seconds on Google. 30 seconds to find this Indian school with the skulls of children run by the Presbyterians 2 years after calling. This stuff is not buried. You just don't look for it. And so I would be hesitant to give you the exceptions, because I know you will use that to comfort yourself and not address the problem, which is the rule. The rule is that Western culture is deeply colonial. It's foundationally based on this doctrine of discovery. It's a bipartisan value that almost the entire institution is working to keep erect. And no one wants to deconstruct it. No one wants to deconstruct it. Well, just one more example. When I was running for president, again, this was after years of doing advocacy and other things, and I had a fair number of followers and people who supported me, volunteered for me, wanted to help me, said, come up and, hey, I want to do this. I could not tell you, I couldn't count the number of people who supported me when I was just out speaking and laying out this vision and talking about this thing, who came to me during the campaign of 2020 and said, Mark, I can't support you and I can't vote for you. A vote for you is a vote for Trump. And I can't risk it. Even if I think you're right, I can't go there. People of color, women, people who had volunteered and supported me for years, people who had given hundreds, even thousands of dollars to my work before I ran for the campaign. People love the idea of change, but we're terrified to actually enact it. We're terrified about the risk involved in actually enacting change. And that's what I'm learning we need to address. We have to stop blaming our politicians and recognize the reason our politicians say the things they say and enact the things they enact and do the things they do is because this is what we expect as American people. Right? This is what we, and so people love the thought of addressing the doctrine of discovery until it comes to land titles. Mm-hmm. Right? I was at Standing Rock. I was there 2 days after. 2 or 3 days, maybe not that, maybe a week or two after. So there was a large gathering at Standing Rock of Christian leaders who came together at Standing Rock. They had a sacred fire in the middle of the camp, and they met there, and they read their denominations and their churches' repudiations of the doctrine of discovery. And they stated how they abhorred this document and how this was a bad thing, and they stood in arm to arm with our native peoples. And I was there 2 weeks later, and I met with one of the people who helped organize it. And I said to him, I said, this is interesting because the doctrine of discovery is the legal precedent for land titles. So I'm curious, when they read their statements of repudiation, did anyone give land title back to the native nations who were there? No, we didn't do that. Well, this probably came together quickly. It might have been hard to arrange all that, so that's not too surprising. But again, the land owned by these denominations, again, it's not based on a treaty, it's based on the doctrine of discovery. So if there ever was a lawsuit brought by a tribe like the United Indian Nation against a denomination saying we want our land back, ultimately their defense would rest on this doctrine of discovery. So I'm curious, when they read the statements of repudiation, did they commit that if they ever got sued for their lands, they would not defend themselves because their defense would be this document that they've already repudiated? And they said, no, we didn't do that either. So no, this was just a photo op then, right? This is just to make you feel better. Nothing changed. And that's the problem. We would love it if we could just repudiate this thing theologically and not deal with the legal ramifications of it. That would be like Jesus coming back, right? If we could keep the fruit of our oppression, not have to worry about it. So this is the challenge, and this is where we have to address this. This is why I love the example of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I was very upset when I found she wrote that because I liked her, and I still like some of the things she did. But I'm just like, these things don't even shock me anymore. I'm like, this is what we do. Thank you for that question.
Thank you. And let's share with our speaker our gratitude.